If you have ADHD or you suspect you do, and you've been on any kind of journey of managing your condition and wanting to improve yourself, you've probably come across a methodology called getting things done, or GTD, invented by a man named David Allen. You may have intuited that this was potentially really valuable and powerful for you, tried it out, and possibly fallen away after a couple of weeks of enthusiastic attempts to where you're doing maybe a few of the practices or really not even any of it, but you have in the back of your mind that this could potentially still be an incredibly valuable way to support yourself with ADHD. As a longtime GTD coach, I see this a lot. And increasingly, people that are coming to me for coaching have been diagnosed in adulthood often with ADHD. So I started looking at this, doing research, working very concertedly with clients to see how can we really overcome the high stakes, as it were, to adopting GTD for someone with ADHD, because it is a potentially huge reward. And I've seen it a lot that people with ADHD who really get GTD often go on to making it a very, very powerful lifelong practice. So I was asked to give a talk for the GTD Nordic meetup to talk specifically about my research and experience with helping people with ADHD to learn GTD and to make it stick and to make it really work for them. Since that time, a lot of people have asked me, "Is there a recording? Can I see that talk?" And we didn't record it, but I thought, actually, it's a shame. It ought to be out there. The information ought to be out there. This information is research and my own thoughts and experiences. It's not official. It's not endorsed by David Allen or his academy or any of his licensees that do the work. This is really, my thinking and reflections. I'll talk in sort of three parts about GTD and ADHD. First, some context and perspective specifically about ADHD that I think is really useful for anyone to understand the condition. And that leads right into why GTD in particular is so valuable for addressing the considerations with having ADHD, and then some best practices for adopting it. You may be tempted to skip straight to the best practices and look for the tips, and that's fine. You're welcome to. But as I said, this kind of builds over time, laying the foundation with, how to sort of think about ADHD, how to think about it in relation to GTD. And my hope is not that you'll just take away a few tips. I mean, I hope you do, but that again, you take away a mindset that may help you discover more and new and different ways of approaching a GTD practice with an ADHD mind that will help you reap the benefit. So, as many of you know, it is a neurobiological condition. That doesn't mean there's a blood test for ADHD, right? It's polygenic, but it is highly heritable. So we know there are physiological bases as well as neurochemical components to the condition. And fundamentally, two that I think are really interesting to look at in relation to GTD are the one that encodes motivation, gratification, accomplishment, the dopamine, and noradrenaline, which boosts attention, inhibition, and working memory. And both of these things play a huge role in what we call executive function, which we'll see is a big thing that GTD addresses very specifically and head on um, in the attempt to support mitigating the behaviors that are the diagnostic behaviors for ADHD, which is either inattention or hyperactivity and impulsivity or both together. There are a lot of misconceptions about ADHD. If you have the condition, you've probably run into these and been, dispelling these, or maybe some of these you didn't know. So again, in the talk, I gave people some time and we kind of reflected on which ones jumped out at people most, or were new or novel. You can pause the video here if you like and have a look and have a think for yourself about what, if any, of these strike you as interesting. Putting together the timeline of the history of adult ADHD in the UK. So I'm originally from California. I have a funny, slightly modified American accent. Sorry about that. But I do live in the UK and I have for many years. So looking at the history specifically in the UK explains an awful lot about why more and more recently, I'd say almost three-quarters of the clients that I coach have a diagnosis of ADHD. So if you were born before the 1970s or mid 1970s, you wouldn't have been diagnosed as a child. It just wasn't being diagnosed in the UK at all. Um, uh, by the time it started to be diagnosed, you would have been an adult. It wasn't recognized as an adult condition until 2008. But not surprisingly, 10 years later, even after they changed the threshold of what you would have to remember and what people would have to back you up on in terms of seeing this in childhood from the age of 7 to the age of 12. I don't know about you, but I do struggle to remember things before the age of 7. Um, Even a decade after all of that had come in, only 8% of the total estimated population of 2 million people, 2 million adults in the UK, were diagnosed. Now, from 2018 to 2024, that skyrocketed from 8% to 20%. So there's this dual perception and reality that are at odds with each other. That ADHD is suddenly this huge trendy thing. It must be caused by our mobile phones, or it's just people are jumping on the bandwagon, or they're seeing this huge acceleration in diagnosis of adult ADHD. In reality, we've accelerated to the point in a very short period of time where now 1 in 5 adults who actually have ADHD have been diagnosed. And that's because it's only very, very recently that that started happening, partly due to it even being recognized as an adult condition, then the age threshold changing to where more people could, sort of remember and back up their childhood experiences, to the wait lists from the National Health Service finally starting to come down from phenomenally long wait lists for this condition to be diagnosed in adulthood to something more reasonable now. So this was a talk on neurodiversity. You've probably heard that term. Um, I think one thing to know and point out about that is that that is a philosophy that arose particularly in the autistic community. So neurodiverse conditions include ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, other DYS prefix conditions, Tourette's. So neurobiological conditions. And from within the autism community in particular, there was an advocacy for greater acceptance of difference, greater accommodation of difference within society. And so the neurodiversity model sort of says the extent to which it is a difference or a difficulty or a disability, one of the big factors there is how much society is accommodating the fact that your mind simply works differently. Now, the medical model is that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and to be a disorder, it has to be impairing. It has to impair you in various existing social domains within society, your education or work or your romantic life or your social life. There has to be impairment. So it can't just be a difference, as it were. It must be a difficulty. And the extent to which it is a difficulty or a disability depends on the degree of impairment within existing society. So there are different paradigms, different models for thinking about what is ADHD. Um, and the neurocomplexity model, which is a third one, I'm going to include some the handouts for this, the slides, and there's some appendices as well, with lots of also notes and citations. So the neurocomplexity model, a third model, is more about focusing on the individual and each person being unique in terms of their needs, both for treatment and for advocacy, and other kinds of support. To me, that model most closely fits with the GTD practice, which is one that's all about empowering the individual, and which doesn't preclude advocating for and changing one's environment as well, but empowering the individual to address some of the very specific challenges of ADHD. Executive function and the impairment of the executive function is one of the biggest features um, of ADHD as a condition. So, and I'm not a big fan of reading slides, but if you want to pause here and take a moment, you can have a look at what some of the features of executive function are, and just some examples I give so that you can kind of get the flavor of what this would look like. And you'll probably notice with this that, of course, Neurotypical people forget things sometimes. And if you're someone with ADHD, hearing, "Oh, I forget things sometimes too," isn't terribly helpful. You if you have a pathological problem with forgetfulness, if you're forgetting things 20 and 30 and 40 times a day. But it does point out that we all have both executive function and have executive function impairment throughout our day and our life. Um, that it very much stems from behaviors that anyone can relate to, but again tips over into a more pathological state due to the extent and severity of that impairment, I would say. And many other things can cause executive function. Just being tired and less stressed and sleep deprived, right? I think new parents probably all are quite impaired in those early days. Addiction is highly impairing. The most impairing addiction, a fairly recent addition to the list of possible diagnoses, is social media addiction. Actually the most impairing of executive function. Depression and anxiety can also impair executive function. They're also highly comorbid, meaning they often go together with ADHD quite often. There's a lot of overlap. But of course, it's important to differentiate in diagnosis for that reason between depression, anxiety, and ADHD as separate conditions. Brain injury and, of course, aging can cause executive function impairment as well. So, again, when we're looking at GTD, it's an incredibly powerful methodology for anyone, everyone who has to define their work to do their work. Anyone, everyone who has a lot going on, who has to think about what they want, who has to organize themselves to achieve their goals. Really, just about all of us, certainly in our personal life, as well as increasingly in very complicated work situations. Right, the stress and the fatigue and the constant bombardment and interruption, I would argue, absolutely lowers executive function for everyone on a temporary basis. And for those with ADHD, it is a chronic condition. So GTD, no surprise in addressing this, is powerful and very effective for those with ADHD. And there are a lot of strengths that come with a different mind, a mind that works a little differently. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if you want to pause and have a look and reflect on some of these, certainly, being good in a crisis, having a bit of a higher risk tolerance, having a wacky sense of humor. There's a lot of great things that seem to come out of that same well, that same in that same basket of ADHD. So, why does GTD work so incredibly well to improve effectiveness for everyone, but to be, absolutely in some ways life changing? And I've seen that time and again for those with ADHD. This is my way of conceiving of it. This is my theory, my bringing together different parts of research as well as my own experience working with people with ADHD and neurotypical people over many, many years. The ADHD track, as it were, is again manifesting behaviors of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity in some combination due to neurobiological difference, whether that's the chemical imbalance or whatever model you subscribe to. Um, it's stemming from the biology. This leads to procrastination and perseveration. Right, these are the manifestations of executive function impairment, which leads to the outcomes of incompletion, failure, missing deadlines, not doing the things you said you would do, constantly forgetting things, and the world giving you lots of feedback about that. Right? Something like 10,000 more negative messages that the ADHD child gets in their early years as compared to the neurotypical child, because we just consider it bad and naughty and wrong to be behaving in these ways. And that can lead to a fixed mindset that this is me, this is how I am. I can never get the right stuff done. I'm always going to be this way, and it's unfortunate. And I've seen that a lot as a progression from this condition into adulthood. The Getting Things Done methodology is a different track. It is about creating a comprehensive work-life methodology that supports you, almost like a second brain, particularly maybe a second prefrontal cortex in particular, that allows you to externalize what you're doing into systems. It allows you to use best practices within the methodology, different specific methods for how you think about your work and represent your work in those systems, and rituals, the habits and behaviors that bring you to engage with the systems frequently enough that you can utilize them to be effective. And doing this, getting things off your mind into a system, trusting your system, using your system, allows you to give appropriate attention to what's going on in your world. It allows you to get into what we call that flow state more often. And this leads to personal effectiveness. This leads to you seeing yourself accomplish, do the things you said you'd do, make things happen on time, fulfill your obligations, as well as go after aspirations and dreams with confidence that you can actually achieve those. And this leads to self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is different than self-esteem, which is a general feeling of goodness, of well-being, and goodness toward yourself. Overall, this is really about the belief that I can do what I need to do to achieve what I want to achieve. Right? That confidence, that innate confidence that comes, not from just feeling good about yourself, but from a track record of having done that over time. As David Allen, one of his slogans was "Make it up, make it happen." Right, and the belief in your ability to do that is self-efficacy. As I started looking at how GTD complements the different elements of executive function, how it boosts and improves them and supports those behaviors, it just was pretty surprising. Both how well it addresses the different components, how comprehensively it does so, and how directly it does so with so many different methods and rituals. And in particular, the one that really stood out to me was the weekly review. Right? That doing this process called the weekly review, there is a reason we say that it really is a foundational part of the methodology. Again, you can pause that slide if you like and trace the different arrows and think about what that means, how those different components relate to those different features of executive function. And this idea of flow, I think, is incredibly powerful. It's that state where you're neither bored nor overwhelmed, but you are progressing, right? You're being challenged, but you're also utilizing, skills that you already have. You're in the zone. And people sometimes talk about hyperfocus in ADHD as a strength, but hyperfocus is kind of a mixed bag, kind of a fuzzy term. It can also mean perseveration, which is excessively focusing or fixating on things when you should have actually probably moved on. It would have been optimal to shift your focus, but you have difficulty in doing so. So through the systems, methods, and rituals, um, continually the GTD process is bringing you out of procrastination, whether that's a state where you're putting off what you know you need to do or have actually even forgotten what it is you need to do and are doing something suboptimal or a range of suboptimal things because of that. Or you're in a perseveration state where you're hyper focused on or sorry, perseverating on one particular thing. And these systems, methods, and rituals are continually supportive of moving the individual back into this flow state. So, in order to overcome the challenges with GTD, this to me is was the big penny that dropped in my looking at all the past work I've done with people and all the research about what is optimal to support people with ADHD in relation to executive function and what's optimal in terms of teaching them and supporting them with adopting and learning new things. So again, there's the two tracks, right? And now you understand more what we mean by flow, what we mean by the systems, methods, and rituals, how that all works. This is my my aha moment was really looking at some of the educational practices and looking at the use of gamification in education. Now, gamification has a bit of a bad name in the 21st century because it's been used by marketing psychology to get people to sort of do what you want to do by using a bit of the dark side of behavioral reinforcement, right? So this is getting you up to the point where you're going to make micropayments in a mobile game, or other things that are a bit sort of nefarious in that they are motivated by wanting your money, basically. But gamification in education has been shown to be very effective with one really, really important caveat. So, gamification in and of itself, when people are going toward the reward, the click, the gem, the sound, the goodie, the high score, whatever it is, for its own sake, really doesn't help with the educational process. But when there's what we call intrinsic motivation, you really want this thing, having those reward systems come back to you periodically and frequently actually really greatly reinforce and support you in moving towards those goals that you've set for yourself, as reinforcement of progress, and a kind of second track that helps give you motivation and keep you going. So Duolingo, for example, is very much based on this principle. If you want to learn a language, having some gamification and regular engagement with that experience can actually help you sort of stay on track, keep going, keep motivated, etc. So, uh, the gamification of work in creating bite-sized next actions and seeing yourself accomplish those, in all the different components of the GTD methodology that provide feedback, that provide the experience of you achieving what you said you wanted to achieve, um, and externalizing in ways that allow you to relate to it a bit more like a game, with a little bit more of that you're doing your work rather than being completely, engrossed and engulfed in and overwhelmed by your work because you have these systems, gives you a little bit of that level of abstraction. And all of these gamification principles, there's a lot of them. The more I looked at the methodology, that are absolutely aligned with gamification. And again, in the appendix to the handouts, I go into detail with a whole chart about that. All of this leads to growth mindset. That's what they found in the educational research. The growth mindset is that sense of, I can find a way. I can find a way around this. I can figure this out. I can work this out. It's those things that come from having a track record of some success, and also having a motivation to want to get to the next little level or star or badge or whatever it is, that leads to this internal sense of, we can figure this out. I can work this out. I can do this. This um, growth mindset again leads to the appropriate attention and flow, which is itself a reward, being in that state, being in the zone. The personal effectiveness and seeing yourself achieve that in a tactical way. Each time you do that, that's a big and very tangible and very real reward. You're accomplishing the things you set out to do in life and in work. And then that overarching self-efficacy, the kind of boss fight level of life, where you've actually overcome perhaps some of that sense of, I always, I always miss these deadlines, and you actually go, no, I can make the deadlines to be able to achieve what I want to achieve here. I've got some track record of having done that, using good systems and tools to help me, so I'm not just relying on the neurobiological basis that has let me down in the past. I'm overcoming that with good strategies and good techniques. So, another one of David's taglines to his third book was "Winning at the game of work and business of life." And again, I don't know what David thinks about the idea that GTD promotes the positive form of gamification, but I do know the more I looked into this, the more this seemed to be baked in as a way to, and a great way to think about GTD as a practice, and why it helps really everyone to stay motivated and positively focused in relation to their work, but why it's absolutely essential for a mind that maybe doesn't always have enough dopamine or noradrenaline going on, doesn't always have enough sort of impulse control and filtration and prioritization naturally happening, to supplement that with this approach that's not only practical, but also is building your sense of self efficacy over time. And of course, the rewards that come back in GTD vary in terms of the timeline, right? You capture something and you know that you're not going to forget it. There's an immediate sense of empowerment when you really get the capture component of getting things done. Reference filing, for example, may take a long time to come back as a rewarding thing for you. So there's a real spectrum of when you experience the benefit and can recognize that you've had the reward for your efforts in the different aspects of the methodology. So one of the things you can do is to work with yourself to find ways to gamify and find ways to make enticing and interesting and useful, and to mark the progress of your implementation of GTD over time. These are just a few ideas. And again, if you want to pause and reflect on these, I would suggest that yes, try them. Absolutely, try some of these, but think about the kind of at the meta level what these are doing, and see if you can come up with some of your own as well. Finally, let's talk about some very practical things you can do to capitalize on the strengths of the ADHD mind and mitigate some of the weaknesses when you're adopting your GTD practice. I think one of the biggest strengths of ADHD is having incredibly broad range of interests, things being interesting and fascinating in ways that maybe other people don't get as much pull from. And of course, the challenge with that, comes that you've got one life to lead. So, um, this question, this fundamental question of, are you committed to something here or not? Right? Is there something you want to do about this or not? And being able to ask yourself that regularly, things you may have committed to at one point, actually you realize need to be renegotiated. You have a different set of priorities or a different workload or whatever. But being able to continually, take this kind of razor to life and separate out what you're committed to from what you're not is incredibly powerful. And just this question, if you ask yourself this on a regular basis, as your mind is kind of being flooded with opportunity and ideas, can really really help. I think, well, I know can help to point you and orientate you in directions that are going to be meaningful to you rather than simply fascinating. A great strength of the ADHD mind is divergent thinking, that ability to rapidly associate between different thoughts and ideas and things that are occurring to you in ways that many people don't. They just kind of think in a very stepwise fashion, which is also, of course, has its strengths. But very often the ADHD mind will catch some not so obvious considerations, some outliers, some outside things. So this idea of thinking out of the box is pretty kind of inherent, I think, in some ways. But because the mind naturally goes to that mode of thinking and gains energy and motivation from doing so, often with bigger things, not with everything, but with bigger things, rather than really trying to force the ADHD mind into, okay, well, what's the very next step here? Um, Identifying what the overall outcome is and doing a bit of that divergent thinking, capturing it, getting it out there. Mind maps are great for this as a representation. Often then will allow you to go back and look at what is the very next step here and what are some other steps. And you may actually come up with a much better next action because you've given your mind the opportunity to do what it does best. Um, the emotional content of our life experience, I think, in some ways can be really heightened in the ADHD mind. We see this with sort of rejection sensitive dysphoria, and maybe the converse of that, praise responsive euphoria as well. Um, but also just in that fascination factor, right? So we're intentional beings. We want things. We desire things. So use that to your advantage. Use that to your advantage with the ADHD mind. When you're struggling, when things are challenging, anxiety is one of the most common coexisting conditions. It can be very easy to be overwhelmed when your outer environment is very busy and your inner environment is equally busy. So, getting clear on what you want to be true, this simple question can be incredibly powerful to put you back in control and to remind you that you have options. You have lots of options in life and in the world. So, when you do figure out what you want to be true, that's not true yet, putting some desire into that, putting some positive emotion into that. The research found that positive self talk and negative self talk actually produced fairly similar outcomes in the end, but only positive self talk improves your self efficacy and actually improves elements of your executive function. Negative self talk just bolsters you into getting the job done because you should, and so the sticks approach does work, but you end up feeling pretty beaten up. Whereas the carrot approach works just as well and builds over time into a greater sense of self long term. So I call it psyching yourself up about something rather than psyching yourself out. And I continually find, at least one positive emotional word to put into my desired outcome statements at all times. Um, for many people doing GTD, being able to just go to a to-do list in between meetings and a next action list within the context of where you are, and pick off the very next step works for them. For people with ADHD, fairly consistently, I find that a simple daily practice of looking at your calendar for the day, looking at the context where you will be, things you will be, have available to you, and decanting that or promoting that into just a today list, can be really, really powerful to help create focus and not overwhelm you by looking at, for example, a huge computer list. Right? The traditional GTD lists were set up sort of pre-pandemic and really built on the experience of a lot of road warriors, right, who were on planes and client sites, and some didn't always have Wi-Fi, and sometimes back home, sometimes not, et cetera. And so, nowadays, looking at just one enormous computer or, list of stuff you can do everywhere, because you always have your phone and so forth, can be really overwhelming. One of the features I really like about Microsoft To Do for this reason is that the My Day feature, when you promote things into My Day, it clears it out at the end of the day. And this forces you to go back and get the benefit of your GTD practice, which is the overview and breadth of options, by then needing to promote back a list of today items each day, so that you're not just sort of dragging around a partial list of what your options are by being lazy and not putting it back into the system for re-review each day. So that's a key. If your list keeper doesn't do that, I would recommend you build the habit of doing that manually. Procrastination, a big issue, and what most of us do is we have a big thing coming. We know it's coming. We know we should be working on it now because our teachers always said start your homework early to be a good person. And so we feel guilty that we're not doing it right up until the 11th hour. Panic, do it, pull it out of the bag, do a good job. Yay, us. But you've really not enjoyed all the, quote unquote, goofing off time leading up to that or whatever you were doing, because it was hanging over you. And then there was a big panic, and now you're kind of exhausted afterward. There's a better way. So strategic procrastination says, actually, having done that, you know exactly how much time it takes. It only took, that few hours before the thing to actually do it. Why not schedule it for then? What that does for the ADHD mind is a couple of things. One, puts you under the gun, and being under pressure actually often brings that neurostimulus out. You actually end up doing a better job at the 11th hour than you would have with a lot more time. And it compresses the time by putting that deadline on the end, a hard, real deadline, so that if it is the kind of thing where you could endlessly go off on tangents, you could always do a better job, you could always keep perfecting and polishing this thing. It really forces you to focus on what are the essential things I need to get done in order to meet this very real deadline. And so you simply schedule it for the 11th hour deliberately, giving yourself plenty of time and maybe a bit of buffer so that you can, in this case, go have lunch and be ready with good blood sugar levels for the big presentation. And it also allows you to be guilt-free leading up to that point about the other things you're doing. So that is one that I found very useful, and to use judiciously and strategically, right? I'm not saying put everything off to the 11th hour, but it can be very powerful for certain things. But all of this, again, those are some very practical things, but ultimately, um, understanding how you can sort of gamify your adoption of GTD, your use of GTD, so that it is stimulating your mind, so that it is playing to your strengths, and so that you're using all the strategies and tricks you can to mitigate, things like working memory and other things that might hold you back from adopting it as a full practice. All of that is so worth doing, not only for the fact that it will give you a system that helps you get the things you want to get done, but for the way it will make you feel about yourself. And that motivation, that confidence, that to me is absolutely invaluable. So again, at this point, we took Q&A. This is just a recorded video. However, I'd love to hear your questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections on this. If this was useful, if you'd like to know any more, please drop comments in the comment of the YouTube video, and I will be monitoring those, and I'll be happy to answer whatever questions come up. Again, I hope this was useful. I hope you take away some things that are encouraging you more than anything, that you can do this. I've seen a lot of people with ADHD adopt GTD. Again, it is higher stakes, more of a challenge to adopt, but profoundly more potential benefit, I think, because it addresses a chronic thing that everyone is dealing with. It helps everyone, but it seems to help people with ADHD across every aspect of their life, really pervasively. So hopefully this is a message of hope, of encouragement, and hopefully there are not only some very practical things that you can take away and try, but the spirit of this goes with you too, which is make it work for you, make it work for your brain. Go for that quality of trusting your choices, getting into the state of flow, and building self-efficacy over time. However you do that, that is so, so valuable. And from my point of view, you can't be doing GTD wrong, as it were, if you're going toward that fundamental spirit and intent. So good luck. Hope this was useful. Strength for the journey.